Hi everyone, welcome to my latest think piece, if you want to call it that. I'm going to be talking about conspiracy theories in general, the ones around COVID-19 in particular because they're current, and why I don't generally subscribe to them, why I don't generally buy into them, and what they tend to be used for in effect, as well as why they might be appealing and why they might contain some truth but a whole lot of untruth at the same time, and the way that this actually operates. And I do want to stress from the start of this is not to say that governments, corporations, and so on, as well as state institutions, aren't often up to their necks in all kinds of shit. They are, and we know about that stuff because it's documented. Sometimes sometime after the event, but it is. But we can look at what they actually do on the surface, because there's enough there to damn them before you start kind of going a little more out there and speculating other things that can actually be used either in dangerous ways in the here and now, or can be used in order to lead people to very dangerous kind of political approaches, because these things are often a recruiting ground for the far right, and there is a long history of this. It's a long history of what was used to enable the Holocaust, what was used to enable the rise of fascism, what is still used in similar ways to this day, and conspiracy thinking often plays a big part in that. So how do these classically run then, conspiracy theories? Usually they point to a sinister or shadowy world leadership, which incidentally is usually a dog whistle. It's usually an anti-Semitic dog whistle in particular. Like violence, racism, oppression, genocide against Jewish people has been enabled for thousands of years by speculating that Jewish people play this role, which is not founded in any reality. You can trace it all the way back to the blood libels coming out of the Vatican. And the reality is it doesn't have a grain of truth. But what it did, together with various states excluding Jewish people from various parts of life, was to enable there to be a diversion, a deflection, to point out this group of people, which usually gets fingered as Jewish people, as somehow sinister, somehow pulling the strings. And just because people don't always overtly refer to Jewish people, this is often what they're driving at. Sometimes they do overtly do it. They absolutely do. Like David Icke has come out with all kinds of anti-Semitism, and his internet presence and his pages are used to spread anti-Semitic ideas. They're used to spread far-right ideas. You can look this up. You can go on there and see what's there. It's deeply unpleasant. And sinister groups, cabals, banking conspiracies tend to be used as a code word for that repeatedly, as an in to pulling people into far-right ideas. This has enabled a huge amount of violence. It enabled the Holocaust to take place far more easily. I'm Jewish myself, and therefore I'm quite vigilant for this stuff. And the same thing tends to apply to pointing to sinister groups as if they somehow have more control than they do. When people start talking about Illuminati or the Freemasons. And the Freemasons is a real group. It exists. Does occult shit. Does various other shit. Has some influences in some ways in terms of what they do for each other. It's also not the secret force controlling the world. It's a form of mysticism that is used in various ways. But is this all powerful? No, because we know who the most powerful people are, and they tend not to hide it. tends to be very overt business interests, capitalist interests. We know who Jeff Bezos is. We know who Mark Zuckerberg is. We know who Bill Gates is. We know who Richard Branson is. We know who Donald Trump is. And we can go on like this. Very, very rich people with very, very key interests. But they don't actually hide it. They endanger people and they exploit people right in front of you. They exploit the world's resources right in front of you. There doesn't actually need to be an extra there. And we can talk about the way in which business interests play into what happens in a viral pandemic such as this one. What they lead to, the way they distort things, the way that they endanger people, but without pretending that the whole thing is some made-up hoax that actually dismisses the evidence in front of us. Now, are spiritual people more prone to investing in conspiracy theories? In some ways, and by spiritual people that tends to be people who've broken with organized religion, although organized religion has been used to spread these things at times as well. It's something else that we could go into. But once people are moving towards a space of being more free thinking, that can be really positive. Challenging institutions, challenging where power is. It's really, really good, really, really useful. Good way to start to break free and start to see alternatives. But that kind of mysticism, that kind of free thinking also needs critical thinking. It needs personal responsibility. Otherwise, not only can you go off on flights of fancy, but you're also actually quite vulnerable to those people who sound more convincing than perhaps they have the right to. And when you look at the kind of stuff that gets put out around this, you can go and watch Plandemic if you want. I've seen it. And it takes a few things that have truth to them and then blows things in a way that tries to conflate many different things in order to try to point you and nudge you in a certain direction. And it uses certain film propaganda techniques. It uses certain techniques such as neuro-linguistic programming in order to do so. People producing that stuff are sophisticated. Just as sophisticated as the mainstream media, just as sophisticated as governments. And you should apply a critical eye to governments, to the mainstream media. Of course you should. But you also need to apply a critical eye to this stuff as well. Because these people also have their own agendas. They are not the magical liberators of your mind. People making these things have their own agendas. Sometimes they have their own corporate or business agendas. Sometimes they have their own political agendas. Okay, you can see the political agendas playing out in front of you at the moment in what different governments are doing around COVID-19. You can see it playing out with a number of governments deliberately spreading confusion, mixed messages, making people more susceptible, more distrusting, blaming each other, taking the heat off of them a lot of the time, spreading confusion, spreading fear. And we can look later on at where these things might come from, who they might be serving, spreading all these mixed messages. Before we even get to conspiracies, everything else, already you have governments telling you different things each day. Stay at home. Except in Britain, that's now becoming stay alert, so it's not stay at home. What's changed? Not a lot. Was the message stay at home before? It was stay at home? No, it wasn't. So it switched back, it switched forth. What are they doing? I'm going to argue the governments there are deliberately spreading confusion in order that you can actually ignore what's in front of you. And what's in front of you is a huge number of people losing their lives at this time. I'm in Britain. We have the highest death count in Europe now. Coming from some way behind to do that. And you can look at the way the government has managed things quite deliberately to do that, and we can look at the ways in which they endanger people by trying to push people to work in unsafe conditions, by not supplying adequate healthcare. All of that is real and in front of you and is enough to damn them. And when you've got enough to damn them, then looking to find some special knowledge or claiming you or somebody else has some special knowledge that they've magically discovered and they can unmask everything, and if only people would understand or listen, then everything would change. Actually, no, it wouldn't, because it wouldn't shift where the power is. It wouldn't shift where the power is. We already have the knowledge that they are killing large numbers of people through their neglect, through their lack of support, through their prioritizing the economy and big business over people. That's right in front of you. That's right in front of you. And those people out protesting to end the shelter-in-place orders, to end the lockdowns, tend to be people who are invested in being on top of other people as well. You're seeing right-wing libertarian demonstrations, veering towards far-right demonstrations. What do they want? They want service workers to be forced back to work to serve them. So straight away, like, what is the interest there? And then what is the interest they might have in trying to claim that this is somehow not a real virus, or fake, or a man-made virus, or the impact of something else, or this, or this, or this, or this? It's to try to get people to do their bidding. Because they like being in control. They like having these things available to them. But they don't give a fuck about the lives of people who they're risking. Just as a lot of governments don't give a fuck about the lives of people who they're risking by not taking this seriously enough, by not tracking, tracing, doing what's necessary in order to actually contain this pandemic in a way in which instantly it's been contained better in some places where governments will approach things differently, not because they're wonderful, but because they're pursuing different ideas of how to run their economies, how to make a profit, short-term, long-term. What does this do? What does this do? Individual interests in different countries, individual governmental interests, slightly different political approaches. None of them really based on the public good, but based on what they feel is going to lead to the highest profits overall for the economy. It's not more than that. And where they're not being quite so nasty, it's also because politically they don't feel able to, which is to do with social forces on the ground there. But it's no surprise that the countries that are being worst hit with deaths, and the deaths are real, by the way, these are excess deaths above what would normally happen at this time. Likely to be an underestimate, because in this country, for example, they're only counting deaths in hospital. But the actual difference between the median death rate for this time of year normally and what it is now, it's big, it's getting bigger. That's real. That's people dying. And I want to stress that as well, because there's a question of empathy here. Are you so keen to embark on your quest for truth and to unmask everything that you're willing to risk people's lives? Genuine question. Genuine question. Think about the impact. Think about what happens if you are actually dismissive of people losing their lives at this time as well. Because that's not empathetic, that's not spiritual, that's self-interested, that's an ego trip and an ego trap again. Convince yourself that you must be uncovering something amazing. Goes very Dan Brown all of a sudden. But Da Vinci Code's a work of fiction. Try and tease these things apart and look at where you are and what you're playing into. So look at a couple of specific COVID-19 conspiracy theories, and I'm not going to go into huge depth because they're debunked all over the place. You can look that stuff up. But firstly, the claim that this is a man-made virus, does that stand up to scrutiny? Actually, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Although Donald Trump sitting there and claiming that this has been made by a lab in China deliberately sets him up as like the hero of the piece, his government as the opposition to. And I want to say, you know, the way Chinese people then get stereotyped within this is xenophobic. It's very familiar, very old stuff. Old stuff that used to get termed things like yellow peril or similar racist conceptions of Chinese people. Suits him to do that. If you're lining up with him, you better have a good reason for it. Because this is like, you know, numero uno fascist leader in the most powerful country in the world. It's not insignificant if you line up with him that you're actually lining up with the biggest interests of big business of all. But what is the reality? The is COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, is a novel coronavirus. It shows up as a zoonotic virus, which is the most common way for a new viral infection to spread to humans. Most likely spread from a bat originally to an intermediate animal and then to humans. And what's more, an awful lot of scientists have predicted this. Not because they're in part of the big conspiracy, but because there's a simple process going on at the moment. Bats are being displaced by human development at a greater rate than pretty much any other mammal. Because of that displacement, they're then coming into contact with species they wouldn't normally come into contact with. The condition in which they also live, the condition in which they are, which causes more viruses to inhabit their bodies, it's also impacted by those environmental changes. What does that mean? That means that it's far, far easier for this process to happen. It's not impossible for governments to work on viruses as weapons, incidentally. Of course they do. They have an interest there. But there's a practical thing here. If you wanted to create a killer virus to infect a large number of people, the most likely way you would do it is to start with a virus that already infects people and to beef it up. Because trying to transform a virus that infects one species to be able to infect another that doesn't already, you're wasting your time. You're wasting your energy. It's not efficient. It's not practical. You wouldn't do it. And this is important not because the science of it is the only thing, but because this is a diversion. It's a deflection. Donald Trump sits there, calls it the Chinese virus, accuses this and that all the time, makes his hands appear much cleaner. And yet, what's the reality? The reality is the response by that government, amongst many others, has been awful, has cost lives, is likely to cost more lives as they open up more and more. The Trump administration is encouraging that. Boris Johnson's administration is encouraging that and encouraging confusion here. You see it with other very right-wing governments. You see it with the Brazilian government. You see it with the Indian government. What is their interest? Their interest is for their big business mates and their own business interests to do very well in a thriving economy. What's not in their interests is people being alive and able to work safely necessarily. Doesn't mean that they will kill huge numbers in one swoop, because that's not great politically, but when it's managed in this way, and you get people blaming each other, turning on each other, and when they are seen to be managing or running the country through a crisis, that's good polling. You become a wartime leader then. very, very convenient politically to do that. And when we spread these kind of ideas about this being lab made or deliberate or anything else, we're actually playing into the hands of the people who are already in power. Within that, we're spreading quite a lot of anti-Chinese racism around this. We've already talked about enabling other forms of racism as well. These are the real impacts this stuff has. And that does impact people's lives. It does empower the far right as well. That's not benign. That's really dangerous. You need to be very careful about what you might be enabling there. And incidentally, in part of it, what do you suppose happens whilst you're distracted? Distracted by the pandemic itself and all the news being about that, and then further distracted by disappearing down one or another rabbit hole over this. Well, what happens when everyone's attention is diverted by something that's real is that governments are highly opportunistic. So what has been happening during this pandemic? As examples, in Hungary, the president has gained emergency powers. By gaining emergency powers, has he used them for public health? No. What's he used them for? He's used them to essentially de-recognize transgender people under the law. It's part of what's likely to be a program of state discrimination and state violence and violence in general. What's happening elsewhere? In North America, indigenous people are being more forcibly cleared off their lands. They're having more of their control of their lands taken away from them, something they've fought a very long time for. In Brazil, there are additional incursions that threaten indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest. Governments all over are suspending or tearing up environmental legislation. These are examples. There are many, many other things because governments are opportunistic. So if we lose the right to public assembly, which we might need to lose during a pandemic outbreak for public safety, what's nasty is the governments then keep that in place and use that to get rid of any dissent or to at least decrease what can be done publicly massively. That is real. That is real. And again, if you are spending your energy, even your activism, going down the conspiracy theorist line rather than dealing with this, which is in front of you, is real, is destroying lives, or is costing lives, maybe further destroying the planet as well. That is enough to focus on, and that can sharpen you. It's this impactful, evidential, it's there, it's something that's happening. Draw that to the attention. Be vigilant against what governments are doing around that. That's in front of you. What you don't need is the extra. You simply don't. They take advantage of these situations. That doesn't mean that they've manufactured the whole thing. No. But they use it for social engineering. They use it for their own ends. You can be vigilant about that, and you need to be. Let's talk about vaccines. Let's talk about what anti-vaxx is. Let's talk about the background to these things. I'll start with a rider. Vaccine tests, medical tests have been used in abominable ways by governments and by pharmaceutical companies. That is a fact. I'm not going to deny that. There have been experiments. Experiments on populations of black people in America, experiments in other parts of the world as well. Deliberately infecting people, whatever else, that's real. That is real. So I'm not going to sit here and say they never do that. But the fact that they do that doesn't make all vaccine science bad, doesn't make all vaccines bad. And a number of other things get enabled by the anti-vax movement that are very, very dangerous. And I do want to stress that. What's my vested interest here? Well, I'm autistic, and anti-vaxxers tend not to like the existence of autistic people. Try to look for a cause, a reason why we're this way, because they'd prefer us not to be this way, they'd prefer us not to exist. How did that all play out? It played out through a faked paper published in a science journal by Professor Andrew Wakefield, who made the false and now fully debunked claim that the MMR vaccine caused people to become autistic. It doesn't, by the way. Being autistic is genetic, has always existed. You inherit it from a parent who has the same genetic variant. It's a different way for your brain and neurology to function. It's not a bad thing. If you think being autistic is a bad thing, then you need to listen to more autistic people, and you probably shouldn't come to this autistic person for a reading in those circumstances. Just saying. And autistic people face all kinds of medical and institutional and structural and personal abuses throughout our lives because hatred is spread towards us and our existence, and people look for a way to get rid of our existence. And that's eugenics, by the way. Now, Professor Wakefield, incidentally, the darling of the anti-vax movement, what was his interest? Well, he had the patent on a rival vaccine that he'd have liked to have sold instead of MMR. And so he faked his results, and there's documented child abuse in his research as well that he carried out, in order to try to get people to stop using MMR in order that he could sell his own vaccine. So look for the interests of the people spreading this stuff, because this has become a popular movement now. It's become a skeptical movement. It's become a movement where people both enable abuse of autistic people and also actually lead to the spread of more infectious diseases, because measles outbreaks go up and so on. Measles is a deadly, very dangerous virus. It's one that has taken a lot of work to reduce the incidence of. One of a number. You see, the use of the MMR vaccine has drastically reduced the incidence of measles. And it's not the only one. Smallpox was eradicated. Smallpox was eradicated very recently, after centuries of people dying really nasty deaths, eradicated by a WHO vaccination program. I want to say that the eradication of smallpox is a good thing. But even better still if the American and Russian governments weren't keeping samples of it in labs, but that's a whole other story, and the reason why they are not the most trustworthy people in the world. But eradication of smallpox, that's good. Now on vaccines in relation to coronavirus. A vaccine for this disease, for this virus, is the most optimistic way of bringing it under control, in a similar way to smallpox. It's also actually really hard to pull off. We haven't had an effective vaccine for a coronavirus so far, and therefore this may not even happen quickly, and we may need to be very careful until it does, or they may need to find a drug to treat it instead, but there is likely to need to be a medical treatment for it, just as there was for smallpox, and just as there have been for other viruses that have been spread, that have formed pandemics. And contracting a virus does not mean that you are failing spiritually, or too attached to certain things, or some other victim blaming crap, and I want to stress that as well. When European people colonized North America and the Americas as a whole, and they spread huge viral agents that were devastating to the indigenous population. That wasn't because the indigenous population was not spiritually advanced enough. It's because these were new viral agents they hadn't encountered yet. And now we're encountering a new viral agent as an entire planet. We talked about smallpox, and yes, this one may well need a vaccine to ultimately bring it under control, stop its spread, stop the danger that it poses. Is there a problem with pharmaceutical companies getting rich off of this? Yeah, of course there fucking is. Come on, that should go without saying. That any form of medicine is subject to patent, and therefore to profit, and therefore to markups, and therefore to manufactured scarcity. All of that is a real problem. It's a problem with the financial and economic system that we live under and the political choices that are made. Because it means that people get denied vital treatment. You can sit there and worry about this extra stuff being done to you, but in reality, most people who need treatment can't fucking get it. Getting healthcare is really fucking hard. You want to cut that off? That's not going to help. It's just not. Big Pharma is not nice. As an institution, as a collection of business interests, it's really unpleasant. Really fucking unpleasant. But that doesn't therefore mean that any medicine being administered is bad. It means that it being done with a profit motive and denial of people who can't pay or anything else is bad. With an outbreak like COVID-19, just like it was with smallpox, they may well need, in practice, governments of the world to administer this universally at cost to them. And yes, they should be tearing up the patents and the contracts and not overpaying. It's absurd what in practice is paid for medicines compared to what they cost to produce. Absolutely absurd. And there are various laws put in place to defend those business interests. That is a problem. Somebody developing a vaccine for a virus that saves potentially a huge number of lives, that's not a problem. The problem is regarding what happens economically around that. I'm scared to even mention this one, but since people bring it up a lot, 5G. 5G is the next generation of mobile phone technology. Requires a lot more masts. Some people have raised concerns about the possible impact of radiation on people's health. Some governments question it, some don't. The reality is it's probably pretty safe. It would be nice to have some more research, but then you need to accept the research if you like. But is COVID-19 caused by 5G? No. There is no scientific mechanism for this. This does not look like the effects of radiation upon people. It looks like the effects of a viral infection. And that's important. It's important because this again has been used to spread confusion, to whip up fear, to whip up panic. It's led to people tearing down or burning down 5G masts where they exist, and where they don't exist in Fiji, it's led people to tear down regular masts, installations, power structures, out of the confusion and fear being spread. And yes, COVID-19 is just as prevalent in countries that don't have 5G technology. So you can't really posit causation there. Like, again, some people may have concerns about the radiation that might come off of these new high-tech phone masks. Other people might look at it and look at the research and be like, actually, that's been researched, that's okay. But what this whole thing is manifestly not, is something that has come about as a result of 5G towers being installed. It simply makes no sense. If you're willing to look at the interests of governments and the interests of big business in what's going on at the moment, have a look at the interests of the people spreading this stuff. And I've talked about Andrew Wakefield as an example already. Very invested in selling his own vaccine. One example. David Icke's website, we talked about it, it's a recruiting ground for the far right. Spreads anti-Semitic ideas, spreads all kinds of reactionary ideas. There's usually homophobia and transphobia in there as well, unsurprisingly. It's the same thing over and over again. Alex Jones is an alt-right figure, not somebody who can be rehabilitated easily. So time and again we're dealing with those as interests. If somebody tries to sell you a holistic treatment as a cure for COVID-19 or as a guaranteed prevention for COVID-19, again, treat that critically and as a business interest. Not to say holistic and complementary medicine is not useful. It is. I wouldn't do my job if I didn't feel it was. I wouldn't get massage, I wouldn't get acupuncture when I'm able to, which doesn't happen in a lockdown, strangely enough, were that not useful and effective. But I don't use it to take the place of medical expertise, of medicine. I use it alongside of it, and I use it because actually getting doctors to take you seriously when you're in various oppressed groups is very, very difficult. Getting the healthcare that you need out of them is very, very difficult. But that's a reason to demand that we get the best, not a reason to refuse it. You can make your own decisions regarding medical treatments for yourself, by all means. But ensure that you are holding a holistic or alternative practitioner or someone trying to sell you a certain way of viewing things to at least the same scrutiny as you hold doctors, medics, pharmaceutical companies as well. Remember, the interest here is to sell you something and extract a profit. More than anything else, especially when it comes to business interests. With doctors and nurses, it can be slightly different because they are generally committed to helping and supporting people. Doesn't mean they can't be affected by biases or anything else. Of course they can, and we've all experienced that. If you've been on the receiving end of medical transphobia, medical fat phobia, medical racism, or anything else, then you know that yes, there are real biases within that. So you hold them under scrutiny. But that doesn't mean, therefore, that everything else that is said must be true. You make a leap there, and it is a costly leap. So bring it back. Bring it back. All you need to do is maintain a critical eye over what is in front of you. And yes, you can look at the business interests, but you can look at the impact and effects that they have in daylight. You can look at people being sent to unsafe workplaces. In manufacturing, in retail, in the service industry. You can look at what that means when there's a pandemic as well. You can look at people being treated in these ways by the system. And there's enough there to get angry about. So you don't need the sinister players backstage, who incidentally, people who really buy into this stuff afford far more credit than they deserve, should they exist. Like, the people in charge of this world are the richest people. I want to be clear on that. Big capitalist interests, billionaires, these people are the richest in the world. Competing interests that sometimes dovetail, as we've talked about. There's no secret to who they are. But they don't have the level of organization that would be required of them to carry a lot of this shit off. They just don't. Managing a team of people, 10 people, 100 people, really fucking difficult. Managing millions of people, all tied up in this grand conspiracy, it just goes beyond what is actually simple, easy, worthwhile to do. It's a flight of fancy in that sense. There is an attraction to that as well, which may be affecting you. What's the attraction? It means someone's in charge. Someone's running things. Someone's calling the shots. Actually, we live in a world where nobody is in charge. There are people, corporations, various other structures and institutions that hold a lot of power, but they do not control everything. And that leads to much greater disaster, why things are not actually coordinated around the international response to COVID-19 in the way that they could be. Because first and foremost, you're dealing with political and economic interests. And I'll leave it at that. That's what it comes back to again and again. Doesn't mean that there isn't some shit out there that gets hidden, gets covered up, gets distorted. There is. But before making those leaps, you need to do a lot more research, and that's genuine research as well, not reading an article, watching a video. Everything that goes into genuine research, that's very, very deep. Very, very deep. And what happens more often is, rather than going deep, somebody is slick in their marketing, feeds on pre-existing suspicions that you have, starts to create paranoia, and creates even more confusion to go with the confusion that those in power are already spreading. Makes you more confused, more fearful as well. The other thing is, if they really were that powerful, and you really had this unique knowledge that would change everything, that would change the world, I hate to say it, but bang, you wouldn't be out there for that long. Can they control everything behind the scenes? No. Can they bump off someone who's a threat? Yes, they can, and they do. Ask Malcolm X, ask Martin Luther King, ask various other people who they've taken out. If they haven't murdered them, they've stuck them in prison for as long as possible. Made them disappear. They can do that. They can do that. If you had that knowledge, that's what they would be doing to you. But actually, it suits corporate powers, the government, for conspiracy theories to be out there. Spreads confusion, diverts attention away from them. Some governments will spread them in their own countries. Some will spread them overseas. Some will do both. And yes, I'm aware that's actually a conspiracy theory itself. but it's one with that bit more evidence behind it. You can take my word for that one or not. Just be very careful, very aware, and keep your eye on who you may be serving when you buy into these things. Have a great day.